Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
In March 1770, a mob in Boston gathered around a group of British soldiers. The mob grew larger and angrier, graduating from throwing snowballs to hurling rocks. When one soldier was clubbed to the ground, the British opened fire on the crowd. Of the 5 civilians killed in what was called the Boston Massacre, one was Crispus Attucks, who may well have been an escaped slave. Few details are known of Attucks and his life prior to the massacre, but he would be hailed as the first martyr of the Revolutionary War. White Southern planters were the wealthiest group in the North American colonies. They owned resources worth more than twice that of propertied men in the northern colonies. But that wealth was tied up in their labor and land. If Parliament ever freed the slaves, Southern planters would be wiped out, losing the value of the slaves, and with no labor force, the products of the land. Slaves also provided a hedge against financial loss. If a crop failed, planters could sell excess slaves to recoup their funds necessary to plant for the next season. In March 1773, the Virginia House of Burgesses resolved to form a committee of correspondence. Massachusetts had formed its own committee 5 months earlier, and the other colonies quickly joined. The purpose of the committees was to organize resistance to British encroachments. Eventually, these committees, bringing the colonies together, would form the government in opposition to Britain in the Revolutionary War. The Tea Act of 1773 was the beginning of the end of British rule in North America. Though the act actually lowered the price of legal tea, the colonists resisted the continuing taxation without representation. Their outrage culminated in the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773. Parliament responded with the Intolerable Acts, which, among other things, brought Massachusetts government under the direct control of British government. Thomas Jefferson included the slave trade and slavery itself as one of the unjust practices forced upon America by Great Britain. In 1774, Jefferson wrote a pamphlet, A Summary View of the Rights of British America.
The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by imposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantages of a few British corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states, and to the rights of human nature, deeply wounded by this infamous practice.
Jefferson was not alone in calling for an end to the slave trade, from both a moral standpoint and as a means of resisting Britain, which gained so much in its odious trade. In July 1774, a set of resolutions was adopted by a committee in Fairfax County, Virginia, that included George Washington and George Mason among its members. The Fairfax County Resolves, as they are called, highlighted a number of the concerns that were leading colonists to seek independence from Britain. Among them was the slave trade, the committee stating, "We take this opportunity of declaring our most earnest wishes to see an entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade." When the First Continental Congress met in October 1774, they used the Fairfax County Resolves as the starting point for a resolution signed by delegates from all of the colonies. The Declaration and Resolves of the First Continental Congress included a range of issues, but one was the Atlantic slave trade.
We will neither import nor purchase any slave imported after the first day of December next, after which time we will wholly discontinue the slave trade, and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels, nor sell our commodities or manufactures to those who are concerned in it.
Individual colonies had sought to end importation of African slaves in the past. Pennsylvania passed bills prohibiting slave trading in 1712, 1714, and 1717, but they were disallowed by the Crown. Massachusetts passed a similar bill in 1774, which was also disallowed. Virginia had opposed the Atlantic slave trade since 1772. Part of their opposition was due to the horrific nature of the Middle Passage. Part was due to their concerns that the slave population in Virginia had already grown dangerously large. And part was due to the fact that if no further slaves were imported from Africa, future slave purchase by South Carolina and Georgia would be from Virginia planters. Regardless of the reason, though the individual colonial governments were unable to outlaw the Atlantic slave trade under British rule, the prohibition by the Continental Congress would stand throughout the war. And war was beginning to look inevitable to some. The Royal Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, responded to the formation of Virginia's Committee of Correspondence by dissolving the Colonial Assembly. Tensions in the colonies rose and then boiled over. Militia companies began to organize within the colonies and to seek out arms and equipment. On April 19th, 1775, the shot heard round the world was fired in the battles of Lexington and Concord. The next day, before news could have even reached Virginia, Lord Dunmore ordered Royal Marines to remove the gunpowder stored in a magazine in Williamsburg and to take it to a Royal Navy ship. The colonists discovered the Marines as they were transporting the gunpowder, and the local militia raced to the scene. Williamsburg's city council insisted that the gunpowder was the property of the colony, not the Crown, and must be returned. Dunmore claimed that he had seized the powder after he had discovered a planned slave rebellion. That was enough to mollify the crowd of Virginians, long fearful of a slave uprising. But when the crowds protested again just 2 days later, Dunmore insisted that if insult or injury were done to his person, he would declare freedom to the slaves and reduce the city of Williamsburg to ashes. He added that if the hostile environment led to battle, that he believed all the slaves would join the side of the British. On May 3rd, the Hanover militia reached Williamsburg, headed by Patrick Henry. Dunmore evacuated his family to York County, where he joined them a month later. He was eventually forced off Virginia soil altogether, taking refuge on a British warship. A few months later, on November 7th, 1775, Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation declaring martial law and called upon all able-bodied men to join him in defending the colony against the rebels. Dunmore's proclamation boldly called upon slaves belonging to colonial patriots to desert their rebellious masters and join his army, promising freedom for them all.
I do require every person capable of bearing arms to resort to His Majesty's standard or be looked upon as traitors to His Majesty's crown and government. And I do hereby further declare all indented servants, Negroes, or others appertaining to rebels, free, that are able and willing to bear arms, they joining His Majesty's troops as soon as may be practical.
Within a week, over 300 slaves had escaped to enlist with Dunmore and join the Loyalist cause, doubling his loyal forces. The proclamation outraged colonials loyal to Britain as well as regular patriots. No one living in a colony with a large slave population could hear the call for what amounted to a slave revolt without feeling terror. In response, the Virginia Assembly declared that the runaway slaves faced the death penalty, but said that runaways who returned on their own would be pardoned. Dunmore organized his black loyalists into the Royal Ethiopian Regiment. They were armed, trained, and given uniforms with "Liberty to Slaves" emblazoned on their chests. The Ethiopian Regiment was blooded in a skirmish with militia at Kemp's Landing, where black loyalists fought side by side with British regulars. And the Battle of Great Bridge, a few weeks later, nearly half of Dunmore's men were freed slaves. That battle was lost to the Patriots. 32 black loyalists were captured and ordered sold in the Caribbean. 800 slaves in all would respond to Dunmore's proclamation, but smallpox took its toll. When Dunmore retreated to New York in August 1776, fewer than half the Ethiopian regiment still lived. Not all British commanders were open to armed blacks fighting for Britain. But Sir Henry Clinton, who replaced Howe in May 1778, issued a proclamation even more expansive than Dunmore's. He proclaimed that all slaves belonging to Patriot owners were now free, regardless of whether they joined the British forces. This cost him some support among Southern Loyalists. Tens of thousands of slaves did escape to the British. It is impossible to know the exact numbers, but Thomas Jefferson estimated that at least 30,000 Virginia slaves had run away to the British by 1778, including 30 from his own home in Monticello. It is estimated that 25,000 escaped bondage in South Carolina during the war, and another 12,000 in Georgia. Some escaped slaves did join the British forces. The largest group, and the only official black provincial unit, was the Black Pioneers. The pioneers served as scouts and performed various public works and engineering tasks, such as digging fortifications. Why would slaves choose to fight for the British, the very people who had taken them or their ancestors from Africa in the first place? How could the slaves trust British promises of freedom? The Founding Fathers should well have understood the siren song of liberty. In truth, most did recognize the evils of slavery, but they generally considered these necessary evils until the South could replace the slaves with another labor force. Leading men such as Jefferson, Franklin, and Washington had repudiated the slave trade and slavery itself, and chastised Britain for forcing slaves upon the colonists in the first place, and creating a dependency of which they could not yet see their way clear. To modern ears, this can sound much like an addict blaming his addiction on the supplier.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.